The History of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Season 1, Episode 10, The Group. My thoughts on Jeff and Susie's thoughts coming up right after this. Hey everyone, this is Yoel, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So grateful to have you. By the way, this is my 5th take doing this. I keep cracking in my voice. Let's see if I can get through this take. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about the history of Curb Your Enthusiasm, picking up where we left off in our series. Today's video is on Season 1, Episode 10, the finale of Season 1, which is called The Group. And this video is commentary both on the show itself, which I go back and rewatch, just like Jeff and Susie do. And speaking of Jeff and Susie, it's also commentary on Jeff and Susie's comments. And so far, I've had some nice feedback, which I'm very grateful to you all for. Whoever has subscribed, thank you so much. It definitely helps me out. If you haven't yet, please do. And without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. And it's funny, the show starts off with Larry getting into trouble for not initiating sex. Cheryl wants to know why she always has to ask Larry, and Larry doesn't have to ask her. And as usual, Jeff has said in his, I think it was in a previous episode, that Larry really does cover every part of the human condition, which I'll get into a little later in this show, in this video as well. And this is no exception, where you have the bickering couple bickering over who initiates sex, who does it more than others, etc., etc., etc. Larry David's response, by the way, is gold. You know, he says he's always available, therefore all you have to do is tap me on the shoulder, yada, yada, yada. And of course, as we know from later on in the show, that Cheryl does tap Larry David on the shoulder, but unfortunately, speaking of taps, Larry says that he's tapped out. So while it was a great excuse that Larry had on the spot that he came up with, so to speak, in the show, speaking, you know, when I say on the spot, I don't mean he came up with the script on the spot, but certainly his character comes up with that on the spot, that I'm always available, just tap me on the shoulder. But it wasn't true, because later on that doesn't turn out to be the case for Larry. Anyway, that was a great start to the episode. And then in the next scene, we have Jeff calling Larry and Cheryl into his office to tell them the good news that Cheryl was chosen to star in the Vagina Monologues. Now, Susie says in the podcast that she actually starred in the Vagina Monologues, and I had no idea. That's an interesting tidbit to know. I thought she was just, quote unquote, a stand-up comic before she went into starring on Curb Your Enthusiasm, but apparently Susie is a woman of many talents, not just stand-up comedy. She also starred in Vagina Monologues. And I actually noted here that the term Vagina Monologues is just a funny name. And actually, in my stand-up bit, I did stand up once as of the date of this recording, and I definitely plan on doing it again. I have to come up with more material. I actually have a whole bit on the Vagina Monologues. I cut it out of the first time that I did stand up. Maybe I'll include it the next time. But it's funny because you see that Larry can't get through the scene without laughing, even in the episode. And then Jeff talked about it as well afterwards with Susie in the podcast, where he's saying how funny the term Vagina Monologues is. Like, picture you had the penis monologues. It just wouldn't work the same way. Although, and this is part of my stand-up bit, there is a show, I don't know if it's still on, I don't know if Vagina Monologues is still going on, but there was something called The Puppetry of the Penis. So there was something on penis, not just vagina. I can't believe I'm saying this on my channel, but this is a channel that has no boundaries, so and no structure, as Joe Rogan always says. So Jeff was kind of onto something when he said the penis monologues. I'm sure he's heard of it. There is the puppetry of the penis, but the Vagina Monologues is definitely far more popular than the puppetry of the penis. Anyway, on that note, so they, after Larry and Cheryl are walking away from the meeting with Jeff, they decide to get him a gift. You know, we've got to get him something. And I just thought it was funny. Jeff and Susie didn't talk about this when they talked about getting him a bottle of scotch, of whiskey. Larry says, yeah, what do they call it? Johnny Goldberg. He's referring to Johnny Walker, of course. But funny how he put in there Johnny Goldberg. I thought Jeff and Susie would touch upon that, but they didn't. And then they bump into Larry's ex-girlfriend, and Jeff and Susie were talking about on the podcast how all of a sudden Cheryl's back goes up. And it is interesting to note that, you know, there definitely is that idea that there are definitely partners in relationships where their backs go up. As Jeff and Susie said, they get very nervous around their partners, ex-partners, whether it's ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend. in my experience, it's not always the case. It really depends on the partner you're with. Some are a little more chilled out, if you will, than others, but definitely there's truth to that, that when you're with somebody and you run into somebody from a previous relationship, it definitely could get tense. Sometimes it could get tense for the person himself or herself, not necessarily the partner. In other words, in this case, it was Cheryl getting tense around Larry and his ex-girlfriend. But in many cases in real life, in my experience, it would be Larry himself getting tense. But of course, in the show, in the episode, Larry David is not going to get uncomfortable. That's for sure. It takes a lot to make him uncomfortable, although he does get uncomfortable later on in the group, as we're going to talk about soon. But generally, these types of situations, Larry is constantly finding himself in, so he doesn't get uncomfortable, but Cheryl definitely does. And Larry goes and tosses the keys to Cheryl as she goes to warm up the car, as Larry's saying. Of course, he's completely clueless. Jeff and Susie talk about that on the podcast. And he tosses the keys to Cheryl, and that's an ode to the current and final season of Curb, where there's a whole episode on tossing keys to the valet driver. So it's interesting that theme of keys tossing, I just noted here, came up in season 1, and it comes up in the last episode. And something that I skipped over is that Cheryl walked out of the meeting with Jeff flashing her vagina monologues. Okay, in other words, she was holding the script in her hands, and when Larry runs into his ex-girlfriend, she's like, to Cheryl, she says, "What is that?" He said, "The vagina monologues." "Oh, you got the part. I was trying out for that. Why couldn't I get it?" There's this concept of evil eye that many people believe in, many people don't, many people do. I think if Cheryl had, again, this is a show, obviously, but in real life, if somebody had just gotten the part, I don't think you want to walk around flashing that script in front of everybody. You'd be best to keep it discreet and not broadcast it to the world. But in this case, Cheryl kind of does broadcast the vagina monologues script to the world, and it ends up costing her in a sense, because later on in the episode, she almost loses the part to Larry's ex-girlfriend. Okay, so it's always better to be discreet about these things rather than kind of flashing your good fortune to the world, especially before it's really solidified, before Cheryl had even started in a single production. Now, then, of course, we've got the whole, I talked about the idea of Larry tapping out when Cheryl does tap him on the shoulder. And Larry says that Cheryl made a brief appearance into his fantasy. It's just classic Larry David, only something that Larry David could think of. And of course, Jeff wants to find out who Larry's ex-girlfriend is, even though Jeff is a married man to the character Susie on the show. You start to get an idea of the type of character that Jeff is. We're starting to get these early kind of introductions to Jeff being that sort of philanderer. I don't know if that's the right word. And Jeff uses his classic line, "That's a big bowl of wrong." And Jeff talks about that in the podcast as well. That's become a catchphrase, and it really has. Jeff is really known for that line, the big bowl of wrong. I mean, he uses big bowl for everything: big bowl of joy, big bowl of fun, but big bowl of wrong he uses. And I think Jeff had said this was the first time he used that expression in Curb, and of course he uses it many times later on. And I talked about how Jeff had talked about Larry getting into all aspects of the human condition. And sure enough, what does Larry cover in the show? A group for incest survivors. So if only Larry David is going to come up with that and have a whole episode based on that. And once again, Larry covering the full gamut of the human experience. And I have notes here that Jeff, at one point in the podcast, I don't mean to get too serious, but at one point, Jeff kind of bashes all men as being dumb. And I'll just say that as a viewer, I don't like when men pander to women in that sense, where they put themselves down and make it sound like they're useless and worthless and dumb and idiots. It's just not true. So Jeff, if you're watching this, don't do that anymore. It's unbecoming. All right. Men and women are equally important, both for their respective roles. I'm not going to get into the whole gender and identity discussion, but I just noted that Jeff was kind of bashing on all men. And I'm going to say, as a man, that I don't believe in male bashing either from men or from women. So Jeff, don't do that anymore. And now back to the lighter side of the episode, or of my show anyway. And so Larry, anyways, I also almost skipped a part about Larry before he's asked to go with his ex-girlfriend to the incest survivor group. Larry, of course, is out eating lunch with her because she had invited him to lunch because she was going to ask him to join her. And of course, the classic, what happens? Cheryl's already has her back up because she's nervous. She wasn't comfortable seeing Larry with his girlfriend. And of course, who walks in? Cheryl. And who does Cheryl walk in with? The woman from the first episode, Mike Myers' ex-wife. I'm forgetting her name. So it's just a classic scene there of uncomfortability, where, if that's a word, where Larry is kind of busted, even though he's not doing anything wrong. His ex-girlfriend asked him to meet him for lunch. Nothing wrong with meeting somebody in a public place, but you can see the optics of it can make it very, very uncomfortable. And something else that I noted here is that later on, as all fans of Curb know, Larry and Cheryl end up getting divorced. And there's an amazing episode where everybody's choosing Cheryl, right? The people that Larry used to think are his couple friends become Cheryl's friends only. And in this episode, Larry's introducing Mike Myers' ex-wife to Larry's ex-girlfriend. He says, "Oh, this is Cheryl's friend," and he goes, "Our friend." And it was an interesting correction there, because in reality, when you do get divorced, I can speak from experience as a divorcee, you really do learn, by and large, who your real friends are, so to speak, and who really the friends are to your ex-wife. And in this case too, Larry introduces Cheryl's friend as Cheryl's friend, as opposed to our friend. Then he corrects himself, but the truth is that she really is Cheryl's friend, much more so than she is Larry David's friend. So I just thought I would point out that interesting tidbit and slice of life. I don't know if Larry had that in mind when he kind of, when he did that, when he said that, oh, it's both of our friends. But because in the later episode he does have the whole idea of, we chose Cheryl, and the Cheryl's friends and couples friends are going with Cheryl. I just thought that this was a neat little introduction, very subtle. You may have missed it if you weren't sort of attuned to it, like I am, picking up on these little details. And of course, you have Larry and the woman, all the women at this support group for incest survivors. By the way, it's interesting that Larry was the only guy there. All right, it was all women there, and you would think maybe in a real group like that, it would be more represented. There would be more men represented. Not that you have to represent, but I would think there'd be more men who would also be victims of incest. But in this episode, Larry is the only man in the room, and it's just so comical to watch his facial expressions and how uncomfortable he is throughout the whole thing. Just vintage Larry David, just completely knocking it out of the park in the humor department. Again, with the subtleties, it's not even what he's saying. It's kind of the camera. Jeff and Susie talked about that. The camera panning in on one survivor, the next survivor, and then Larry David sitting there looking immensely uncomfortable, not knowing what to do with himself. And the woman who does end up playing I think she's the coordinator of the vagina monologues at the end of the episode. She's played by Lorraine Newman is her name, and she stars on the episode, on the podcast. And Susie says, and Jeff say how wonderful she was in the episode, and she really was very believable, did a fantastic job. I did not know she was part of the original cast of Saturday Night Live. It's another reason I love watching the history of Curb Your Enthusiasm. You get all these, interesting facts for movie and show nerds like me. I find this stuff very interesting. So I did not know that this Lorraine Newman was part of that. And I have in my notes here as well, where Susie uses the word verpitzt or whatever, which means all done up, another Yiddishism. But this time, in the past few videos that I've done, I've had to explain what Susie's saying. She doesn't always explain her Yiddishisms or Yiddish expressions. In this episode, she does explain the Yiddish expression verpischt that she uses. So that was interesting to me as well. Anyway, back to the whole group scene. Larry introduces himself as Todd. If there's anybody who's not a Todd, it's Larry. He could have maybe gone with Chris, but maybe that's too obvious of a name that he would never have. But Todd for Larry David is just too funny. And I had that in my notes, and Jeff has that as well. It talks about that in this podcast. And again, I also noted this, and Jeff and Susie talked about this, where Larry's talking about the pillows on the couch, and he's carrying on about some stupid details about pillows. And again, who talks about that? This inane chatter I talked about in the last video, or maybe 2 videos ago, where they're waiting in line at the pharmacy, and Larry's talking about the goat cheese, and the goat cheese wasn't good at the restaurant. Just stupid little chatter that does happen in real life as you're waiting in line or something, but Larry includes it in the show, and it just makes it feel so real and just so funny because it's so true. So here again about the pillows. And then Larry, after Lorraine, the character Lorraine's playing, meets, so hey, what happens is, after a whole long sort of roundabout way, Cheryl ends up losing the part to Larry's ex-girlfriend, but then Larry's ex-girlfriend gets into a car accident with Jeff after Jeff was trying to pick her up in a hotel room using the Johnny Walker or maybe I think it was Blue Label, or the Johnny Goldberg, as Larry David called it. So Cheryl gets back into the vagina monologues. Then we see Lorraine Newman's character walking into the dressing room, and that's when Cheryl's are fapished. And of course, she says, Todd? And Cheryl's wondering, what the hell's going on over here? Who the hell's Todd? And Larry's like, no, I use different names all the time. And of course, Larry David has to tell her that he'll never spill his secret to anybody. But obviously, Larry David says, I'll never tell anybody what happened and what we were in. But of course, later on, he spills his beans to Cheryl completely. Anyway, then you cut to the final episode. And by the way, I wrote down here that it was a genius plan how Larry David, what was Larry going to do? Larry and Cheryl had this whole conundrum now that he told Cheryl about the incest survivor group that this Lorraine Newman's character is in. How are they going to wiggle out of this? Because Cheryl still wants to be in the vagina monologues, which Lorraine Newman is a coordinator of. So he comes up with this plan that he tells Lorraine Newman's character that it was Gambling Anonymous, and I'm not going to tell anybody, and that way everybody's reputation is saved, so to speak. But anyway, then they get to the final, scene of, or the final sort of part of the episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and Jeff and Cheryl are there. And it's just perfect how Larry's uncle, who's played, I forgot his name, they mentioned him a few times, also does a nice job playing his uncle. Kind of looks like Larry, so I assume it's Larry's dad's brother. Oh yeah, I had it in my notes because Susie was saying that Larry's uncle's name in the show is Nat, and Larry's father, who hadn't yet been introduced, his name ends up being Nat as well. But the show, I don't believe the show was clear if that was Larry's dad's brother or mom's brother. So if it was Larry's mom's brother, it works that Larry's mom's brother would have the name Nat, and so would his dad. But clearly it seemed that the guy looks like Larry. I think that was intentional somewhat, the actor playing Larry's uncle in this show. So Larry, it must have been Larry's dad's brother. And that's the interesting thing about continuity that Susie talks about. As a viewer, as a fan, I never picked up on that, obviously, but Susie notices that the dad is Nat, and in the first episode before the dad is introduced, the uncle's name is also Nat. It's very funny. And anyway, they run into each other, and I'm not going to summarize the whole episode. That's not the point of my video. You can watch the history of Curb Your Enthusiasm, where Susie does an excellent job doing that. But it was just really funny how that all came together again, and just a wonderful finale to that season, to season 1. I love how Jeff says, I have here in my notes, that everybody loves a great look back. As Susie said, I hope you all enjoyed the look back to season 1. And my answer to Susie is yes, very much so. Keep doing it, Jeff and Susie. It's fantastic. I'm looking forward to season 2. And Jeff says we have to come up with a better way to end, but don't cut the video. I love how authentic Jeff is. I've talked about that in earlier videos. He doesn't want that part edited. He wants the viewer to listen and watch how Jeff is saying their endings are terrible. And sometimes I feel like I've got to work on my endings as well. So Jeff, I relate to you. And with that, that is the ending to my video. I hope you found that entertaining, insightful, informative. If I forgot something, or you noticed something that I didn't talk about, or something that I did, but you wanted to add to that or give your 2 cents, please leave that in the comments. Your feedback is always welcome. Once again, don't forget to subscribe. If you have already, thanks so much. If you haven't, it would be helping me. It would also help you not miss a future video, to hit that thumb up like button, and to check out other videos in my library, which are both on the history of Curb Your Enthusiasm, some other fun stuff, my first time doing stand-up comedy, and some more serious stuff, but I consider it fun, but also serious, the idea of consciousness. And I've got a whole series on Michael Singer's Living Untethered. Okay, so thanks once again for visiting, for watching, for listening, if you were listening while you worked in the background. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you next video. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed that video. I've got plenty more in my videos library. If there's a topic you'd like me to discuss, feel free to leave that in the comments and I'll do my best to address it. If you can like the video, I'd be very grateful. As well, if you subscribed, you'd be helping me out. You'd also be helping yourself out to not miss a future video. Thanks so much. Have a great day.